So of course I'd like to start by saying thank you everyone for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong and today we're talking about custom properties, drawings, and drawing templates and all the ways that we can tie these things together. As I always say with these webinars, I really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions dialog in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question and I'll do my best to stop and address the questions from time to time as we're going through today's webinar. Now, if you follow Onshape closely, you'll know that we update roughly every 3 weeks. And in a recent update, we added the ability to map properties to drawings, to create your own custom properties in the case of a company. So all kinds of very cool stuff with managing your custom properties. And so that's the topic for today. How are we going to create custom properties? How do we insert that data into drawings? And then how does that carry over to the drawing template? So let's get started. Now, as I always say with these webinars, again, feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. This is going to be a short webinar, so again, feel free to ask any questions. We can certainly, use some time up answering any questions that you have, so feel free. But I'm going to dig straight into it. Now, the agenda today is real simple. I want to start off with introducing the new custom properties functionality. It's not just the ability to create your own properties, but it's also the new properties editor. And I think for a lot of users out there, they may be satisfied with the default properties. There's just no fast way to input the property information. I'm going to walk you through a way we can do that. We can now control or shift select different things within it and add properties to a whole bunch of parts or assemblies at once real quickly. And it makes a big difference when we talk about inputting that metadata. Now, when we talk about this, we of course really want to talk about how this ties into drawings. And another key new feature that was added with this most recent update is the ability to insert from a referenced part or referenced assembly in your drawing. I'm going to walk you through the details for that in just a moment. Now, I'm going to finish things off here with discussing custom properties. And of course, through all of this, I'm going to show you how it's done in Onshape. So we're going to focus on the things you'll need to know to actually do this in Onshape. So again, we'll start off just by introducing some of the new functionality around properties, inserting properties into drawings, and then get into custom properties. Now, as I always say, again, feel free to ask any questions. I'll do my best to stop and address them from time to time. All right, so let's get right into it. Now, the first thing that I want to stress is, even if you have no interest in creating your own properties, there's a new properties editor and new properties by default for everyone available. So you don't have to create your own properties. There's a lot of new properties already added, and there's a faster way to input information, and that's what we're going to show you in just a second. So the new properties editor is definitely something you should be excited about if you're managing all your metadata and this is an important thing to you. Just keep in mind this new properties editor is going to make it a lot faster. All right, so let's get into that first, and just jumping out of the slide deck here, let's jump into Onshape. I want to focus real simple example, just a few parts, 16 in this case in my assembly, and I want to get into the properties for each of these different things, whether it be parts, assemblies, drawings, even imported files or applications you can associate properties with. Now, if you haven't used workspace properties before, you'll find it in the top left corner. So in the top left corner, you have the document menu. Click the document menu and you'll see workspace properties. This is the same as it was before. What's different is what you're seeing here. And this is the new property editor dialog. This allows you to really quickly go through and add properties. Now you have your workspace level properties, but if I drill down, I can expand out here. I can see the part studios associated with the document, the assembly associated with the document, and I can expand out part studios if my part studio has multiple parts within it. As I start to drill down into this, you can see all the properties for this part. Now, by default, you're going to see new properties, even if you've never used this before. Just realize vendor, project, those things are new properties being added as of this most recent update. Right? So now you have name, description, part number, revision, state, vendor, project, product line, and then 3 title properties that you can add to. Now, we also have the ability to create your own custom properties if you're the admin or the owner of a company. And that allows you to add your own custom properties in. So things like you can see here, I've added a property for finish or maybe a property for project number. So if you're an admin or an owner of a company, you can create your own company level properties that propagate out to all the documents owned by that company. So these are the new property editor. And as you can imagine, if I wanted to change a finish, I could just type in a value. So a few things to keep in mind. As soon as you start typing in a value, you're going to get a little indicator that something has changed. So if I get out of this, I can go back and find, okay, this is the part that I modified. Keep in mind, as you're doing this, as I start to modify more and more things, if I want to save the changes, I have two options to point out: apply and save. Apply will apply the changes, but leave the dialog open so that you can continue modifying. Save will save the changes and close the dialog. Right? So once you're done, you say, okay, I've added all the values that I want. I click save. It saves everything, closes the dialog. If I want to apply a property and then continue editing properties, I would use apply. Right? So apply and save here at the bottom. Of course, close, like the name implies, closes without saving. Will these properties be added in OpenBOM? A good question. I'm sure in a matter of time, yes, absolutely. I know there are certain limitations to certain things, like, for example, weight is currently a limitation. So there are certain limitations with OpenBOM and properties, but definitely something I'm sure they're actively working on. All right, so I mentioned before, this is a much easier way of inserting properties into your document, and you may ask why. The big thing, I think, and a lot of users asked for this, and we really didn't have a way to accomplish it in the past, is in this properties editor, you can select 3, 4, 10, 20, 100 parts and edit the properties for all of those at once. And I think that was one of the biggest limitations of past properties managers that we've had, is you had to do them one at a time. So now you can shift select or control select, or do all the usual combining of selections, and then just enter a property, right? Then I'm changing this property for all parts that I've selected, or assemblies, right? So just keep in mind, control select, shift select. If you're using a Mac, it's command select, but it's just a way of selecting a lot of things at once and then editing the property for that thing. And remember, it could be parts, it could be assemblies, it could be drawings, it could be imported files. It's up to you how to do that. Now, the next question that I see already is, does material property show here? And the answer is no, not yet. That's something that we're aware of and working on. Material property available in OpenBOM, available here as something that you can link to, is something we don't have just yet, but we are actively working on. All right, so this is the new property editor. Again, I really recommend shift selecting, control selecting if you have a lot of properties you want to apply at once. It just makes it much easier. Once you're done, you can hit apply. That will allow you to save those changes, but leave the dialog open so that you can keep going. Or if you're done, you can just click save. All right. Now, the key thing again is, using this properties dialog allows you to input all this metadata and use it in different places. One big example would be OpenBOM, which was mentioned earlier. Another one would be, of course, drawings. Now, the natural question is, when I start inputting all of this information, is where can I use this? And so one big thing that I want to point out, let's create a new drawing here, is in the latest update, just a few weeks ago now, we added the ability to insert from the referenced part or assembly. So let's say that I insert this large arm from this assembly. One new thing that I want to point out, if I right-click the sheet, I go to Sheet Properties, you can see Reference. So this is the part that it's referencing. The reason this is important is if I insert a note, for instance, let's say I insert a note here, I have a new drop-down to choose the Sheet Reference property. Now, if you're having any kind of issues with this, just know we're actively working on a bug with it right now. But just realize sheet reference properties, it's just a matter of choosing the sheet reference. It will then pull in that value from the part or assembly. You can see large arm here. Hit the green check OK. And now I have a value that's linked to that name property. Right now, as I mentioned before, we are experiencing an issue. We have an issue we know of with documents that are shared and don't belong to a company. It's a real specific scenario, but just keep in mind we're actively working on it, and we're also working on improvements for it. So things like material is a good example. Weight is another good example. Those types of things. Just keep in mind. Will this work for assemblies? Yeah. The assemblies will have their own properties separate from the parts that belong to the assemblies. Right. Question: do property changes show in the part history? Yes. If I go into the history, you'll see change metadata and then refers to multiple parts. I changed multiple parts at once. So when you do change the properties, it is a step in the history. All right. So I mentioned before, real simple, of course. Adding custom properties to your document, just go to the workspace properties, input values. You can shift select and control select. You can do all of that stuff to make it faster to input a lot of values to a lot of parts real quickly, so you don't have to do them one at a time. One other thing that I wanted to point out is the concept of a version specific property. A version property is something that can only be changed while creating a version. You may have noticed, if I jump back into, forgive me there, workspace properties, you may have noticed that some of these cannot be changed, namely revision and state. These are two properties that, as specified, can only be changed while creating a version, or, of course, they can only be changed associated with a version. You can come back and change these later, but they're only editable as associated with a version, not a workspace. So if I create a new version, let's call this V1, you have the option to create version and edit properties, right? So this will allow you to come in and make those changes to revision, to state. Another commonly asked question: what if I've released my design and I want to set the state of all parts in my document to released? I can control select everything here and set it to released, right? So if you're trying to change revision, if you're trying to change state, just keep in mind those are associated with a version, right? So you can either change them as you're creating a version or go back to the version properties and change them later. But just keep in mind there are certain properties that you can only associate with a version. I'm going to show you an example in a minute how we can actually create one of those. All right, so again, version specific properties like revision, like state, just keep in mind you can only change those not in a workspace, but in a version. Question: I create my own property and link it onto the drawing, but nothing shows up. Just get the dash. Is that part of the bug you just talked about? All other properties work fine. I would have to look specifically at your scenario, so forgive me. I will say that you can insert properties and then link to them. It's a really specific scenario that I'm aware of, so it's not a broad. It's a specific permission, specific scenario type of thing. So what I would say is, if you're go into the actual workspace properties, actually edit that property, maybe change the value in that property, and then go back and reinsert the note. Does it update? If not, let us know. Let us know with the report a bug or the submit feedback under the help menu. Question: can properties be inherited or derived from other parts? I don't believe so. No, I'm not aware of a way to say that as I create a new part, it should bring in all these properties from a past part. You can, as I mentioned, control select and make them all the same, but that's a manual approach. It's not inheriting or in any way linked to another. So I'm fairly confident the answer to your question is no. All right, so moving on. Now, we've discussed inserting properties into your drawing, right? So here I've got this large arm note. Essentially, it's just a linked note to the property of name for this part. Now, the key thing there, what's new with this latest update, is when we go into the sheet properties, we have this reference. And by default, whatever the first thing that you insert is into that drawing is your default reference. So if I insert in an assembly, that's is my first view, that's my reference. If I insert a part, that's my reference. If I insert 2 or more different things, then I have an option to choose what I want as my reference. But again, the first thing that you insert will be the default reference. That's where it's looking to grab the properties that we saw in that dropdown, right? So just keep in mind the first view that you create is going to be your reference for all these properties that we mentioned. And the key is just anytime you're inserting a note, you're going to see this new dropdown for insert sheet reference properties, right? And you can see it's not just the standard Onshape properties, it's also custom properties that I've added. Things like finish and project number are not standard properties, but I've added them to this document and they're therefore selectable here. All right, so that's how we can insert these properties into the drawing. Now, the next natural question is, how do I go about making this a part of the template so that as I create new drawings, these things automatically populate and I don't have to worry about manually inserting notes each time that are linked. And in general, this is not necessarily specific to any of the properties that we're talking about, but in general, if you're looking to create a template, this is also something we're working on, but there is a fairly simple workflow that you can use to take something like, a drawing you've already created and turn that into a template for yourself. So, well, the first thing I would say is, set up all of the settings that you want, your company logos, your linked properties and the corresponding places in the title block. Do all that kind of work first to a standard, drawing that you want to turn into a template. And then you can right-click a drawing and choose Export and choose Format DWT, Drawing Template. Okay, give your template a name, some kind of useful name. Let's say Drawing Template. Right. If you have any kind of issues with polylines, I wouldn't worry too much about this if you just bring it back into Onshape. But if you're using this elsewhere, you may need to explode the text into polylines. We're going to leave this as just simple text, hit export, and all that's going to do is save a DWT file to my local disk, right, to my local drive. Now I can take that and bring it into any document and use it as a drawing template. Now, just keep in mind, how you choose to organize is entirely up to you. I like the idea of creating a document called Drawing Template, right? And maybe storing all of my drawing templates in there. It's entirely up to you. You can store your templates any way you'd like. I'll just create a new document called Drawing Templates and then import the DWT. Now, the DWT, by the way, can be modified in other applications. So if you have AutoCAD, if you have DraftSight, if you have one of those other kinds of applications that can modify 2D template files, you can make changes in those other applications and then import it in. Right now, all I'm doing, of course, is choosing import, browsing to the file that I'd like to import. Right now, after I do this, it's now an option when I go to create a new drawing. So it will point to that drawing. So just keep in mind, again, that's really all it takes. You take what I would recommend, by the way, and this is a bit of an aside, but let's say that you wanted to take Onshape's drawing templates. All right, let's do drawing templates. Here's Onshape drawing templates, right? And I have a few different options here. I can take a copy of any of these. You can see here's the Onshape provided templates. I can right-click and copy these and then download the DWTs, or even just open and download the DWTs from here. And this is using now Onshape's standard drawing templates. So I can right-click here, copy a workspace, create my own document to store my templates, or just open this document, download my DWTs, and modify them. Right? So again, all it really takes, though, is when you're in the Create dialog, you'll see, if you search by My Documents or Created by Me, you're going to see a list of all of your drawing templates. Right? So you can choose one here, hit OK. But that's really all it takes to create a custom quote-unquote template, is you take one either from Onshape, take one from your own library. If you have a library of DWT files, you can certainly do that. Then bring that into a document. Whether you choose to store it in a certain project or in your own document called drawing templates, that's entirely up to you. Anywhere that you have an imported DWT, Onshape will recognize it and allow you to choose it as an option when you click that My Documents. And that's another thing too, when you create your drawing, by default you get recently opened, which makes sense, but that first time, make sure to choose My Documents or Created by Me, and then go through and find the exact DWT that you want. All right, so we've discussed exporting templates. Setting up your template is just a matter of choosing the one that you want. A lot of users out there may already have a template. You can import that as a DWT and work with that too. But if you don't, just take the Onshape template, export it, make all the modifications you want if you do, and then bring that back in, and you have your own custom template. All right, so the last thing that I wanted to mention here today is custom properties. And when I say custom properties, I essentially mean any properties outside of that default list. So, as I mentioned, you have a pretty long list of properties to choose from, and I think for a lot of users that's sufficient. But there are, of course, companies out there and organizations that like to see things a certain way. They like to have certain properties associated with CAD models, and they've always done it that way. We want to continue to do it that way. So what I'd like to walk you through is creating your own custom properties. It's important to keep in mind this is a company level functionality, which means you need Onshape Professional and you need to have a company created in order to do that. Even if your company just has one person, that's fine. As you'll see in my example, it's just one person, but these are associated with the company. And the reason for that is, as I create a new document, if that document is owned by the company, then it will have to abide by certain rules. These properties will come in by default. So I don't have to worry about distributing standard properties lists or anything like that. As long as whoever creates the document creates it owned by the company, all the properties I've created will automatically be there. Right? So think of this as a company level property management thing, where I can create these properties and any document owned by that automatically has them. Now, the key to this, of course, is in your Manage Account settings. When you've established your company, you'll see new options for properties. So if I go to the top right corner, choose Manage Account, you'll see on the bottom under My Company, Properties. Right? Now, you have a list of default properties. Right? So these are the same you see before. There are a few things that I want to point out before we get into creating one. First, of course, you have your list of properties. It's worth pointing out, though, you cannot, once a property is created and used, you cannot delete it. Right? So just keep in mind, once I create a name property and I start inputting name properties in different documents and all that, you cannot delete it. You can set it to inactive, which means it cannot be used, but you cannot delete it. So really, think, about how to create new properties and how you want to manage those things. So name, description, part number, revision, these are all active properties in your document. Now, let's say, for instance, I wanted a different part number than Onshape provides. I want to do something else. I can set this part number to inactive, create my own part number property, and manage it any way I'd like. So again, you can't delete them, but inactive hides them essentially so that they can't be created. So again, your default list is here. You can filter, you can find. So I can say, show me all the properties that are associated with just parts, or all objects, document, assembly level, right? So you can filter by different lists. You can also show the inactive properties. But you'll notice if I try and select one and delete, I can't. And that's because they were used. So the only things that you can delete are what we call pending properties. And I'm going to go over that in a second. All right, so that's working with your default list of properties. I can left click in here and see all the details of the name property, for example. Right, I can see it's a required field. I can see the state is active. It's a string value. This is just the default name property. Right? Now, if I go back, let's create a property. Right? So I click create property. This takes me to the new property section, and it's pretty straightforward. You work your way from top to bottom. So in this case, I can say all object types, parts, assemblies, drawings. So maybe I want to create a property that only applies to parts or only applies to drawings. You can do that. Or let's say that I want to create a property called project number, right? And it applies to parts, assemblies, and part studios. And then we'll call this project number. Now, a few things to keep in mind. Anything with an asterisk is required, right? So you'll see name, what type of property is it. By default, this you can see it's a string, which project number would be. I'm typing in a string for the project number, but it may be something like a Boolean. It may be, is this a true false? So I can say Boolean and establish a true false value, right? I can have an integer, have the user punch in a number, a single whole number or a double. So it's entirely up to me how I want to set up what the property is, what type of property it is. In this case, we'll just leave it set to string. Now, a few things when we do this, when we just have a property that we want to create, there are a few things to keep in mind as you're creating it. First off, do you want the property to be edited with a version associated with the version or the workspace? Now, it's entirely up to you how you choose to do that, but it is an option in this company properties section. So just keep in mind, if you want to associate this property with versions and not the active workspace, then you'll want to check that accordingly, right? So you can see edit value in workspace. Another thing I want to mention is the required field. If you want this property to be required, then check required, and you'll see default value then becomes a requirement. And that's one thing to point out in when you require a property like this, you must have some default value so that when new parts are created, that's what it's given. So just keep in mind, if you check required, you must put in a default value. Now let's get into that. The last thing that I want to point out in this custom properties is the validations. So a commonly asked question is there a way to force the user to only put in a certain series of numbers or a certain type of structure to the way we do part numbers? And the answer is yes. You have a few things that you can do. You can check multi-line, gives you the ability to do multi-line, min, max, length. So I can establish that you can't have anything bigger than 10 characters, right? So you can define a min, max, length, and it will then give the user an error if they don't meet that condition. And then we have pattern, and this allows us to use an expression. So let's say that my part numbering scheme was PN dash, and then any combination of 5 numbers, right? So like 0 through 9, close the bracket. Just a typical expression, we'll say 5, right? So pattern would be project number dash, and then 5 numbers to indicate the project number. So again, just keep in mind, you can force rules that require the user to do it a certain way, right? And if they don't meet that condition, then you'll get an error, right? Pattern must match. You can see my default value I'm establishing here. This doesn't have 4. This has 4 numbers, not 5. If I add that 5th number, it satisfies that condition, and I can move on. And this is the same thing the user will see when they go to input a property value for this property, right? If they don't input the right combination of, in this case, PN dash numbers, then I'm going to give them an error, right? They have to fit that criteria. So you can have what we call validations. You'll see that at the very bottom. You have min, max, length, pretty straightforward if you just want to limit the number of characters. And then you have a way to establish a pattern. It's not just that. You can do like A to Z combinations, so any letters with capital letters with this or lowercase letters with that. So you have different combinations that you can define as expressions for your pattern. All right, so that is one of the last things that I wanted to mention here. Now, of course, the big thing with this is as we go back, let's jump back into the document here. If I go to workspace properties, you'll see, let's go back down into my large arm. Here is my project number, again, with that same requirement that I fill in the pattern matching this, right? So if I change that and say, okay, it's only 4 numbers at the end of the PN dash, you can see it tells me this must match this pattern, etc. Right? So just keep in mind, you can, as a company owner or admin, you can create custom properties. You'll see those properties in any company-owned dialogues, and you can even force them to abide by rules like what I've shown you here today. All right, so I know there are quite a few questions that I haven't gotten to, so bear with me. I am going to stick around and answer them. That is what I had planned for you. If you have any specific questions, stick around. Make sure to answer or ask those in the questions dialog in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll make sure to get to them. Just real quickly, jumping back to some of the things to summarize. First off, inserting properties into drawings, you'll see a new drop-down when inserting a note. So when you create a note, you're going to see a new icon, a new menu that says Insert Sheet Reference Properties, and this will give you the list of properties to choose from. Now, custom templates are created using a DWT, and you can export a drawing as a DWT and then just import that into a document. If you have your own DWT, you can import that into a document too, and then just use that template when you go to start a new drawing. You'll see it as an option listed. Now, this also, works well in the scenario of linking to those properties. So if you're, trying to import properties and kind of automate that workflow for yourself, definitely consider creating a new drawing template. Now, custom properties, owners and admins of companies can create new properties, and that's an important thing. The properties themselves are associated with the company, and any document created by that company will have those properties, including any requirements that you may have of the properties, like validations. So you can require properties, you can require the properties to be in a certain format. Again, one thing to keep in mind, properties once active cannot be deleted. So once you've used them in a document, they cannot be deleted. And they can only be set to inactive. Right? I can set them to inactive, they're no longer seen. But because they're used in documents, they cannot be deleted. So you can only delete a property in that pending state. And I didn't mention it earlier, but let's just get back real quickly to it. As I create a property, initially it's in the publish state pending. By default, when you create a new property, the default publish state is pending. It's not visible to anyone. It isn't until I choose active, right, and go down and save my changes that is then visible to anyone else. But again, and you'll even get a little message saying this cannot be undone, right? You can set it to inactive later. So let's say that, a year from now we decide this property, we don't want it anymore. I can choose inactive, and then it will no longer be visible, but it will always be there. All right, so that is one last thing I forgot to mention there. The publish state, by default, when you create a new property, it's set to pending. If you want to see it in all your documents, make sure to set it to active. All right, so that is what I had planned for you. I know there are quite a few questions. I'm going to stick around and make sure to get to all of them. But I want to say thank you, everyone, and have a good day.